The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Introduce John, who was born and raised in Massachusetts. Where in Massachusetts?
Easton.
Right here! When he's not busy teaching the English language arts to juvenile offenders, he's making memories with his family and entertaining readers with his stories. Tonight he's going to discuss writing and publishing and his process, his inspiration for the subject, and this series, and we'll close with a reading from the book and a book signing out in the hallway. How's that?
That sounds great. Well, thank you everyone for being here. This is what, you're all in a dream right now. This is my dream and it's come true and you're all just here supporting me and I love it. All the people I love are in this room. Well, there's other people I love, but everyone in this room I love. So, as she said, I grew up in Easton and I have spent countless hours in this library. This was the library I grew up reading. I would read in there for hours because my mother would bring, if you know Shelley, you know that she loves books. So she would go in and walk out with a stack of books. I would get lost in books about pirates in the kids section for, like I said, it felt like hours. So anything with a pirate in it, I was reading anything like where you outwit pirates. So I think younger me thought pirates were going to be a much bigger problem later on in life. And I've run into none, much like quicksand, none of that at Borderland. But what I did, so Robert Louis Stevenson taught me nothing about dealing with the world or preparing for the world, but my mother and my father fostered in me a love of telling stories, reading stories, anything related to stories. They started me off with that, and so I'll be forever grateful for that. And so I was just driving down the road the other day, and when I saw that, the author talk, John Cady, that was something, I've been driving down, seeing that sign for years now, and it's always had someone else's name on it, and I've always been like, I really want to be on that sign. Just someday I want to be on that sign. And someday it's now. So again, thank you for being part of this. So it's a dream 25 years in the making, and I'm not saying that to boast about my perseverance or anything. I'm really just saying it because there's no expiration date on dreams. You hold on to it, it's gonna happen. No matter what it is, no matter what age you are, hold on to those dreams because it's gonna happen. And when it does, especially, it's taken, like I said, it's taken quite a while, but all that time preparing for this day makes this day all that much more amazing, much more special. And again, I'm glad that all the people I love are here. So basically, my writing journey started with, I would be telling writing short stories in high school for Mrs. Boyle, but she's not here, but she got me started kind of on it, whether she knows it or not. And eventually, I went to college, Manhattan College, and I was majoring in education originally, but then I decided I kind of want to tell stories. I want to get back to telling stories. And so I called my parents, and my hands were sweating. I'm like, how do you tell your parents that you want to go into film and not education? It's telling stories. So, but my parents were really cool about it, always supportive like they always are. So I started my journey basically writing screenplays, and then I decided to make the shift into writing books, because books you can just have more, I think you can have more fun with it. You can explore different worlds that you might not be able to explore on the page of a screenplay. So that's how I ended up writing manuscripts. And then I would write a number of stories, a number of manuscripts, send them out to agents, nothing. All ended up in the circular file, which is what we call the trash. So, but again, it was all those times of that made this moment that much more special. So eventually, my wife's cousin was saying to me one time at a cookout, he said, hey, have you ever thought about writing horror? And my answer was no. I don't like horror. I don't watch horror movies. Horror and I are not friends. But he said, well, if you write short stories, they can get into anthologies. You don't need an agent, and they can get on like the cover, like on the bookshelves in like Barnes & Noble and stuff. I said, I like horror. I'm going to write a horror story. And so I wrote my first horror story, and then I gave it to my sister, who is my beta reader. If anyone unfamiliar with the term beta reader, they are the reader that you trust with everything you write, and they're going to tell you if it's good or if it's garbage. And fortunately, I haven't had many. I'm sure there were some that were garbage, but she didn't say they were garbage. My sister didn't. Yeah. Evidently, Larry Flegman. Yes, that was my garbage. That was the one that never made it to print. But I've always trusted her with it. So I gave her my first horror story that I was going to submit to a thing, and she said, good writing, you didn't kill anyone. And so I said, I don't want to kill anyone. She said, well, you don't want to write horror then. So I said, okay, I will kill someone on the pages of my book. So then I sent that story in after I got my sister's approval. I sent that story into the publisher. They published it, put it in their anthology, and then that kicked off about a couple years of me writing horror, which still sounds weird in my head, but I had about 25 short stories published in anthologies, and ultimately I made a middle grade horror book called Attack of the 3D Zombies that was published. So that was my first time a publisher grabbed my book, said I want to publish it, and so that's when the dream really got going. That's really where it picked up speed. And so that same publisher wanted a few more books, but then at one point or another, something happened, so they weren't able to publish the books that were to follow. So I was heartbroken. I was thinking, that might have been it. That might have been my run. It might be over now, but you know what? The dream was to get published, be a published author. It happened. Be happy. Go to your classroom because you love your classroom. So, which I was going to stay in the classroom regardless, but one day on Facebook, as fate would have it, I call it divine intervention, I saw a post from a fellow writer that his wife is in the horror community, but he had written a book about angels. So I had said, all right, well, I wrote a book about an angel a number of years ago, but I'm going to give you the back, and that book became this one, and I'm going to give you the backstory on that now. So my students, I teach in an I teach in a juvenile detention center, and so a lot of the students that I have in there, they're not big readers. In there, sometimes if you're lucky, you'll get a group of them that do want to read, but they just want to read to kill time, basically. So I had this one group, I was fortunate to have this one group one time that they would just go to my bookshelf, grab whatever they could. They would fly through books, and a lot of them liked fantasy. They liked fantasy, and they liked these urban, books that are set in urban areas called Blueford High. It's basically, it's all about their environment, basically the environment that they grew up in. The people deal with the same problems they deal with, so, which are very different from any problems I've ever had to deal with in Easton, or, it's just one of those things. They come from neighborhoods where crime is high and poverty's high, and it's their way of dealing with it is the same way that kids deal with it in the books that they read. And plus, and on the other hand, they like their fantasy books, so it's probably an escape from this world that they don't want any part of anymore. So basically I said, you guys seem to like these fantasy books one day, and one kid said, yeah, we do, and he said, I just can't really relate to any of the protagonists. Well, he didn't say protagonists, he said heroes, but he said, I can't relate to any of the heroes, and I said, oh, I'm like, oh, that stings. He's like, none of them come from our kind of circumstances, none of them look like us, all, this, that, and the other thing. And so I'm like, oh, well, I don't write that kind of story. So I'm like, good luck with that. I hope you find your fantasy book with these characters in it that you can relate to, because if I even tried to write urban, like a book set in an urban area like that in the environment they grew up with, it's not gonna look genuine. And if I try to write fantasy in my mind, I'm like, I don't write fantasy. If I try to write fantasy, any worlds I create are just gonna look forced, foolish, and what's this guy doing? So basically, like I said, I was stuck in middle grade horror, middle grade, just regular books, middle grade fiction that was my, I was in that limbo, and I'm like, I can't write the books that these kids want. I really hope they get the books that they want, but it's just not in my comfort zone. And so, I'm not going to say it was that night, because that would be like too much of a movie, but somewhere within that month span, I had this weird dream where I was sitting in a nursing home that was very much like the nursing home where my grandmother passed away. So it looked exactly like her room, and I'm sitting in there, and there's an old guy sitting in the bed next to me. I'm sitting bedside to him, and I've never seen him before. So I'm in a dream. I don't know that it's a dream. So I'm sitting there just looking at the guy, and I'm going to keep him company. And then all of a sudden, this girl comes in that's dressed like, basically like one of my students. I teach boys, but you know, the female counterpart of like the boys. So she walks in, looks at me, bends over, kisses the guy on the forehead, then flatlined. He's dead. So I'm sitting there. She walks out, and I wake up the next morning. I'm like, what the heck was that? What was that? Like, that makes no sense to me. So I grab my notebook. Like, if anything doesn't make sense to me, I'm like, this sounds good, though. So I write it down. And probably, like, a few days later, I'm sitting there with the same group of students reading their same fantasy books that they can't relate to the protagonist. I said, wait a minute. I might have something here. And then that something turned into Angela of Death. So basically, those students were my target audience. I want everyone to read it and enjoy it, because I think everyone can get lost in a good story, but they were my target audience. So I was fortunate, like I said, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. When I saw that Facebook, so when I shopped the book, or I wrote the book, I shopped it around to all these different agents back then, because I didn't know indie publishers back then. I didn't know any of the small presses. So I shopped it around to agents, trying to get, you know, some sort of big book deal for it, so these kids could read that book. And so I shopped it around to the agents. Every agent I shopped it around to, nope, nobody wants angels. Nobody wants angels. So I'm like, people do want angels. And they're like, nope, we're agents. We know what people want. You don't. They don't want angels. They want werewolves fighting vampires for girls. And I'm like, they want Twilight. I don't write Twilight. So anything, and if I tried to write Twilight, it wouldn't have, I don't want to say it wouldn't have been genuine, because those things don't exist anyways. So, but that's not my mind doesn't think that way. I don't create worlds where wolves are fighting vampires. But evidently I create worlds where angels exist, where angels of death kill old men. I don't know. So I shopped it around. Nobody wanted it. No one at all. Every 5 years or so, I shopped it around. Again, no one. I'm like, this is never going to take off. And then I said, it's only going to be on my flash drive or on my computer. I'm the only one that's ever going to lay eyes on this. So eventually, I saw on Facebook this guy, Joshua Lloyd Fox. He's an author, and he's my publisher by chance. And he had a series of books called The Archangel's Missions. Very good. I've read a few of the books. Very good. But I'm like, the thing that stuck out to me, I was like, angels. This guy's a publisher, writes about angels. He might like this. So I sent him a synopsis for the book, and he said, "You brilliant bastard, send it to me." And I'm like, what? I'm like, I'm like, fate, divine intervention. It all happened like right in that instant. I'm like, I ran into my wife's office. She works from home. I ran into her office. She told me to get out, but I'm like, no, you don't understand. You don't understand. Somebody wants it. Somebody finally wants it. So she knew it, I told her, I'm like, Angel of Death. And she's like, oh. So basically we sent it, and he said, I love it. He said, I'm going to publish it. And then this was all one book together. Well, I started out with, it was two books. I started out, I broke, and then I put them together because I thought fantasy books need to be longer. So he takes it, he reads it. He says, I love it, but I want to break it in half. And I'm like, awesome. In my mind, I'm like, that gets me more readers. Like, well, it's like the kids can read more of my work. They can get multiple books. And so I said, yeah, well, I originally was going to break it at this point anyways. And he goes, what? That happens? And I'm like, oh, spoiler alert. But I'm like, you said you read it. But it was, but he was excited about it anyways. And other than me, my sister actually read it, the beta reader, and then my wife, we were the only ones excited about this until this guy saw it, the synopsis and read it, and he's like, I need it. And he said, so he put it on Facebook one day, and he said, releasing book 1 of a trilogy. So I'm like, trilogy, awesome. I didn't write book 3 yet. I'm like, I have to start writing book 3. But it was one of those things where, again, my mind was not in fantasy mode. So fantasy series like Harry Potter, like you need to like think about the future. You need to think where all these characters are going. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, I love these characters. And eventually you have to kill them in the series. But it was one of those things where I had to put my mind in that fantasy mindset, and I just had to branch out and start creating more world, like creating a larger world for them, more storyline, more villains. The whole thing, it's just gotten exciting. And again, it's great that you're all involved. I consider you all involved because it's a dream and you're all here, and I couldn't picture this dream any better. So without further ado, I'm going to read some of the book, some of the excerpts from the book, and then I'm going to ask, I'm going to give you a Q&A session so you can ask me whatever you want about the book. And then we'll end with, I'll sit out there and sign some books for you if you have books for me to sign. And if you don't, we have books out there and you can pick some and I'll sign it for you. All right? Okay. Let me get my readers, because I need readers now. I didn't need readers when I wrote this, for the record.
They have been writers.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. So this is the author's preface for the next book, just so I wanted to catch it up. It kind of touches upon what I just told you about with my students, but it isn't often a teacher hears the words, I don't really read when I'm on the out. In fact, I dare say you'd only hear it from an incarcerated student. Those are the students I'm fortunate enough to work with every day. I get to see them shine in ways the rest of society doesn't get to see. I consider myself blessed to be their teacher. Anyways, as I alluded to earlier, it's common for my students to have a long-distance relationship with reading. The only time they typically see one another is in the classroom, and there often needs to be an incentive on the table. To be fair, my relationship with reading in my teenage years wasn't any closer. However, this isn't about me, it's about them and how they unknowingly inspired me to pen Angela of Death. Every now and then, a casual reader will find his way into my classroom. Sometimes two will. A little over a decade ago, I found myself with a classroom full of them. These young men even asked me to bring books back to their hut, a.k.a. that's what they call their cell, the hut. To which I always replied, of course. Their genre of choice was fantasy. They also flew through any inner-city set teen fiction they could get their hands on, mostly because they could relate to the setting and the situations the protagonists found themselves embroiled in. I wrote in neither of those genres at the time. I couldn't build worlds worthy of the page, and I couldn't relate to the world they knew. I was jealous of any writer who could keep these readers turning the page to see what happened next. You guys really like fantasy, huh? I remember asking. I knew they did. I just wanted to build rapport with them. It's an important step for any teacher to take, but it's particularly beneficial where I teach. Yeah, one of them replied, keeping his spot in his book with his right hand while partially closing it with his left. The only problem is I can't really relate to the heroes, he added. Another kid nodded, eyes still on his book. I couldn't help but notice he had pluralized hero. That spoke volumes. I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't find the words. I figured anything I said would sound out of touch and possibly even insensitive. Instead, I offered my patented, that sucks, nod. I wish I could have held my own in either genre and faked it to make it in the other, so I could give them the hero they could relate to. As it stood, my imagination wouldn't have gotten me far in either genre. Bummer. Shortly thereafter, I fully believed this to be a case of divine intervention. I had a dream that made 0 sense to me at the time, but would make all of the sense in the world once I began writing it down. It was a scene that would serve as the direct inspiration for the second chapter in Angela of Death, and the spark I needed to introduce my students to a hero they could finally relate to. In this dream, I was seated bedside to an elderly gentleman in a room reminiscent of the one my grandmother spent her final days in. In any case, there I am, sitting with this man I had never seen before. He wasn't my grandfather, which would have at least made a hint of sense. He was just a random guy, but I felt sitting there with him was the right thing to do. Not long into the dream, a young lady who could have been plucked directly from the cast of Boys in the Hood or a similar film stepped into this room, leaned over his bed, and planted a soft kiss right on his forehead. The machine he was hooked up to broke the news to me that he had died. She cast me a comforting smile and then stepped from the room. I immediately woke up, wrote down whatever I could remember, and then returned to sleep. What I found in my notebook the following morning were the words that would give birth to the Angela of Death series. The day I was able to hand out copies of Angela of Death to my students, knowing fully well they were the inspiration for it, was a dream come true. Talk about pressure, though. There are target audiences, and then there are target audiences. This baby was written specifically for them. They had feedback from me every morning that followed, all positive, thankfully. Some claimed it was fire, while others claimed it was tough. The general consensus was it was good. Every piece of feedback was delivered with a smile and met with a bigger smile. While this series is for them, I believe every reader who longs to get lost in a good book will enjoy it. And so I'll read pieces now from that second chapter, which really was the dream that, like I said, got it all going. Okay. This is from Sean's perspective. So he didn't. It's broken up. The books are broken up into perspectives from Angela, then from Sean. They're the two main characters. So he didn't look good. That's all I remember about the day prior to Angela's involvement. I just sat there bedside, wondering if he was going to make it through the night, and wondering why none of his surviving children, my mother's siblings, had returned any of my calls. I guess I shouldn't have been too surprised. I mean, they really only cared about themselves. At least this was my take on them. He was in that nursing home for over a month, and two of his children, the ones who could boast they visited, only showed up. It was when he first got there, and I hadn't seen them since. In fact, the next time I saw any of them was at his funeral and then the reading of his will. They weren't thrilled that he left me the house, a house I'd lived in for 3 years taking care of him. When my parents were killed in a car accident my senior year, he had me come live with him. Even though his health was deteriorating, I held my own taking care of him for a while. Once I began to struggle, he figured it was in our best interest to bring in a hospice nurse, Mary. She worked out nicely for a while, but when his condition took a turn for the worse, she broke it to me that she needed more assistance than we could provide. She was right, too. He, along with the other patients at St. Joseph's, had a full team of support staff taking care of them. And believe me, they needed it. Mary and I definitely would have been in over our head. They were great at what they did. In fact, the only time I ever feared for his safety was when I heard a commotion in the hallway outside his room one night. I opened his door a crack and found a gangster-looking girl attacking a couple of the people out there. That was Angela. Her victims didn't look like they were staff members, but this didn't matter to me. I guess in all the excitement, it didn't even dawn on me that the actual staff members were ignoring these attacks. I doubt I would have tried to alert them to it anyway, since I was so afraid. I wouldn't have wanted to draw her attention to our room. I mean, in all honesty, if she manhandled those two guys who were considerably larger than me, then what was I going to do in the way of stopping her? I really wanted no part of her. She was scary. I figured this was the last place I'd have to worry about a street thug, albeit a female thug. She certainly didn't look like a female. She certainly didn't fight like a female. Damn. Not wanting to take any further chances of being discovered, I backed away from the door and sat bedside once again. I silently prayed she'd get what she came for and leave. Suddenly, like I was stuck in some kind of slasher flick, our door opened and she stepped in. I froze. Pathetic. She froze as well when she noticed me staring at her. She made it seem like I was the out-of-place one in that room. How's that for a twist? Once she must have finally gotten over the shock of finding me there, she made her way over to the bed. I found the courage to stand up, but she calmly motioned for me to sit back down, and I did. She no longer seemed like a threat, and she was looking upon my grandfather with such caring eyes. Just as he looked up into those eyes, she leaned over and kissed him on the forehead. His eyes instantly closed and his breathing ceased. He was dead. She gave me one more confused look before she took off. I didn't know whether or not to go after her or stay with my grandfather. This whole thing was so outlandish, I'd have been surprised if I had known how to react. I mean, this girl had literally just given my grandfather the kiss of death after giving an all-out beatdown to two full-grown men. I'd like to say I stayed behind to protect him, but it was more an act of cowardice than anything else. Besides, the damage had obviously already been done. He was gone. Once I figured she was gone, I braved poking my head out into the hallway. Luckily, she was nowhere to be found. "Hey!" I shouted toward the nurse's station, startling them. "Yes?" a woman on the shorter side asked, incredulously. I looked at her as though she had two heads. Was she serious? I thought. That girl just killed my grandfather. I pointed toward the exit. She looked confusedly at the door and then back at me. Then they all looked at me as though I was the one with two heads. "What?" the nurse asked, dropping whatever she was doing or pretending to do. She then hurried over to me. "What girl, honey? What are you talking about?" She didn't even allow me to explain myself, rushing past me into the room. I guess she needed to confirm what I'd told her about my grandfather first. Made sense. I let the door swing closed behind me. She was busy checking whatever needed checking. I'm sure there was a protocol to follow. Now, what's this about a girl, she asked, without so much as looking up at me. The girl, I answered, bewildered. The one who just attacked those two guys out there. I motioned toward the hallway. The nurse finally looked up at me, appearing utterly confused. Clearly, she hadn't seen a thing. What are you talking about, she asked. What attack? What happened? Was I losing it? In the hallway, I began. Dear, I think you may have dreamed all this, the nurse suggested, which made more sense than I wanted it to. You've been spending a lot of time here lately, and I'm sure it's been exhausting at times. Couple that with a traumatic experience like this, and it's completely understandable. You're dreaming something like this. It was so real, though, I recalled. She looked right at me and then kissed him on the forehead, and that was it. He was gone. The nurse sighed. I think it was a dream, honey, she reiterated. I began shaking my head, but she cut me off, nodding. We were right out there the whole time. I didn't see anyone come into this room, and we all certainly would have noticed if some sort of an attack had gone on out there. Don't you think? Yeah, I reluctantly agreed. I guess you're right. I glanced down at my grandfather's lifeless body. Unfortunately, the only part of this I knew for sure was real was that he was gone, taken peacefully in his sleep, and mine, apparently. I'll notify his other surviving family members, she said. Thank you was all I could get out before she left the room. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead to where he sees Angela again. So this is at the cemetery when his grandfather's being buried. She was there, just as she was the night she took him from us. She wasn't hidden amongst the mourners like one might expect. Instead, she stood right out in the open, just beyond his gravesite for all to see, yet no one noticed. She was pretty much staring me down throughout the goings-on. Just as everyone was making their way back to their car, she walked off deeper into the cemetery. I turned to my aunt and hugged her. She clearly wasn't expecting it. You can feel when somebody isn't expecting your hug. They almost always ended a little prematurely with the, okay, break it up, tap to your upper back. I released her and discovered her bug-eyed expression awaiting me. My uncle just looked on, a little unsure. Just, thanks for what you did in the car, I said, and I suppose I meant it too. Oh, okay, she said, then offered my uncle a bewildered glance. I think I'm just going to take a walk to clear my head, I explained. Okay, dear, she said before checking her watch. Just don't be too late, okay? We're having everyone back to my house. Oh, you can go ahead, I suggested. I've got my phone on me. I'll call for a ride when I'm finished. This could take a while. She looked a little unsure. Let him go, Linda, Uncle Peter said. He'll be fine, and I need to pick up some beer on the way. Why was I standing around as though I needed their permission? I slowly turned and walked off in Angela's direction, not even sticking around for Aunt Linda's approval. Angela must have known I'd come after her. I knew a slowed walk when I saw one. She was reading somebody's stone when I finally caught up to her. Is she one of yours too? I built up the nerve to ask. She turned to me. What? She asked her, I said, motioning to the headstone of a woman who died a year and some change earlier at 75. Did you kiss her too? No, she said, looking offended, I'd asked. Had she forgotten she was the reason I was there? It wasn't such a far-fetched notion she'd kiss this woman too. I mean, something had to have drawn her to this particular stone. Well, yeah, a lot of times, just not in the way you mean. She was my grandmother. Oh, I began. Sorry. She went back to staring at her grandmother's stone. What are you, by the way, I asked. She seemed to go on the defensive when I asked this. She looked like a typical young woman. I think the only thing that stood out for me was that she could easily hold her own against two full-grown men. Also, I'd have been willing to bet my inheritance most people couldn't kill a man with a kiss. Combine all of this with the fact that apparently only I could see and speak with her, and my question seemed a lot more reasonable than she had given it credit for. She still didn't have an answer for me, and we were probably nearing the minute mark, so I pressed her. A ghost? She seemed to be at least entertaining this one. Are you really? Not exactly, she finally said. At least I don't think so. You don't think so? I continued. So then you might be. I only asked because it seemed like the only one who can see you, and seems like I'm the only one who can see you, and I'd hate it if that meant I was crazy. She smirked. You're not loco, she explained. I only knew about a D's worth of high school Spanish, if that, but loco was pretty much one of the words everyone knew, thanks in large part to pop culture. At least I'm willing to bet this was why I knew it, so thank you, Cypress Hill. I'm an angel, she revealed. My name's Angela. I'm Sean, I said, as though I were chatting it up with a regular girl. For some reason, an angel wasn't quite as frightening as a ghost. Still, I thought angels were supposed to be peaceful and, winged. What she did in that hallway was anything but peaceful, and aside from the obvious differences, the makeup of her body didn't seem all that different from mine. First of all, I was defending myself, she began. Secondly, I haven't earned them yet. And oh yeah, I can read minds now too. I'm afraid I had nothing for her at that point, be it verbally or mentally. Exactly how do you follow something like that? I was checking on you today, she added. Me? I asked incredulously. I shrugged my shoulders. I'm fine, I guess, other than the fact that I have no idea what's going on right now. She looked like she had something important to tell me, but she decided to keep it to herself, whatever it was. This wasn't very fair, considering she could read minds and I couldn't. Now she looked a little disappointed. You're right, she said. This was going to take some getting used to, her hearing my thoughts. Okay, I think you're hot, I blurted out. At first, I'll admit I was a little turned off by the whole gangster girl thing, but I'm over it. And I figured I might as well tell you now so I don't make things awkward without realizing I've made them awkward. She smiled, blushing. Thanks, but my days of earthly desires are behind me, she gently replied. Well, that's definitely the kindest way I've ever been shot down, I admitted. It's much easier to swallow than the old, I just want to be friends. And apparently this is one of those cases where it really is you, not me. So thank you for that, I guess. She laughed. Is there some place we can talk in private so nobody thinks you're losing your mind? Sure, I answered, looking around. Personally, I didn't really care what any gravediggers thought of me. Anyway, anyone I needed to worry about had already gone back to my aunt's house, I assumed. We can walk to my place. It isn't too far from here. So, well, from that, I'm not going to give any more, but they well, I'll give you a little bit more. They end up a couple, so to speak. So I was still in Twilight mode when I wrote it. I'm like, maybe I should make them a couple, but even though she doesn't have earthly desires, but it makes it work. We make it work. So yeah, basically that, like I said, that chapter 2, what I read there, that gave birth to the whole thing, and it was inspired by the dream that I had. So that, as a result, book 1 and 2 were a result of that, and book 3 is already written, and it's dropping March 25th of this upcoming March. So thank you. Let me get some water. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask the author? The lady on the back. Mom.
I was going to ask you, but I think you explained it very nicely using your sequencing of using separate people for each chapter, their thoughts on it. You know, one would be Angela, one would be Sean.
Yeah, so I wrote it that way just because I wanted to be, I don't even know what type of writing you would call it, but I started doing it with a book that I had written once and self-published called Staying After for Miss Jones. So basically, I wanted to have one continuous story told from 2 different perspectives. So the 2 main characters, wherever one chapter would end, the other one would immediately pick off, almost like a relay race of a book, basically, from the character to character. So I thought it was kind of neat writing it that way, and I hadn't seen that done yet. I'm sure someone else has done it. I just hadn't seen it done yet, so I was starting to have fun with it, and then I'm like, oh, this might actually be my style of writing. You know, it's first person, but it basically, first person with multiple characters, like it jumps from character to character. I tried to limit it to 2 for now, because I don't think it would confuse anybody, but just to err on the side of caution, I just kept it at 2 for now. So, oh, sorry. Okay, go ahead.
So what part of writing do you struggle with the most? Is it story or character or description?
Really?
What do you really have to work at?
World building. So especially in the fantasy genre, so it's set in, on Earth, it's set in our world, but it's one of those where when you bring it into fantasy, I've learned, I've been reading a couple, some fantasy series over the years, and they build, even when it's set in our world, they build upon it, and they bring in things, like, they almost like bring in characters from other worlds that were created, and I need to get better at that, and I have gotten better over the course of writing this, but that's one of the things I can always improve on, and I struggle with it just because I'm so used to, I started out writing just, your average middle grade fiction, like things that happen in this world, like nothing supernatural or anything about it. So that now that I'm having such a blast writing these types of stories, that's where I kind of expanding on. That's, and like any other writer, I get the occasional writer's block, but so the way I deal with that is every night, no matter what, after my wife and kids go to bed, I write for an hour. I dedicate an hour just to writing. If I walk away with a paragraph, as long as it's a well-written paragraph and it's progressing the story, then I'm happy. If I go off and I have like 3 pages, then that's a great night. I'm exhausted the next day, but with a smile on my face. So, but basically, yeah, those are the 2 common things that I run into that I struggle with sometimes.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So after your book drops, your 3rd book of the series drops in March, what's next? A continuation in fantasy or back to horror or a combination?
Eventually, I'm going to branch off with some of the other characters in the series. So my publisher has encouraged me to do that. In the meantime, the thing I'm working on now is I'm writing some kind of like a collection of anecdotes of teaching over the years, like teaching these students, because there's so many. Like I was saying, I get to see the part of them that not everyone else gets to see. Like when you see about a lot of these kids, you'll see it on the news, or you'll see it, like I said, in movies based on it that glorifies some of the gang violence and whatnot. But I get to see the part that everyone doesn't get to see. I get to see them encourage their fellow student who has never, he struggles with reading, like to the point where he gets nerve-wracked over it. I've seen 4 kids just be his #1 cheerleaders in the world at that moment. And it's things like that are the greatest moments I have in education, and I wasn't even instrumental in that. They were instrumental in helping each other out. And so I want to feel like a book, my goal right now is, in the publisher's own interest in it, is I want to fill a book of that. I want to show everyone what I get to see. And so it's one of those things. In my mind, it is like I try to write a hero for them, but in this book that I'm writing right now, I want to show everyone that they can be the hero, that they can have the heroic moments and the wonderful moments, and so yeah.
Without giving too much away, at the end of book 1, did you write the end of Sean's scene in similar to what he did for the Destinas to what Jesus did?
Yes. A lot of my faith came through in this book,
Yeah.
and I was so it's one of those things where those at the time I wrote, especially at the time I wrote this book, I was a lot of what I found in the Bible and whatever in the Bible, like a lot of that was coming through in the pages, and I'm like, this fits perfect. It's one of those things where that works in this story, and a lot of people will be able to relate to that, and maybe some people who aren't familiar with that story will notice that it has plucked from my faith and whatnot, and that might encourage them to read into that a little more. So, but yes, a lot of that played into
I
that.
noticed you didn't touch on it later on in the book, so I didn't know if you put that in there to see if the reader was paying attention.
Well, no, I mean, that's one of those things. Sometimes, it's funny, if it was, it was unintentional, but some of those things,
This sounds familiar.
yeah. Some of the things that come in, which weren't intentional, but the other, not even relating just to that, but other things, people will be like, "Ooh, did you mean to do this?" And I'm like, "No." It was one of those things. I can't even say I'm on that level, deep level. I was writing a story, and a lot of my faith poured into the book, but also other things just came into my mind, and I wrote it, and I was fleshing out the story, and then people would come and they're like, "Hey, I like what you did that," and then they unpack a lot of stuff that I didn't even know I had stuck in the suitcase, and so I was. But
do you have an outline that you build first for where you'd like the book to go, or just kind of form organically as you're going along?
So all I really knew was I wanted her. I basically, again, pulling from when I was reading the Bible, I knew there was in the Bible there's going to be a great battle in heaven, the first battle in heaven. Satan was cast out of heaven, and he brought a third of the angels. So I'm like, ooh, there's already there's the enemy in the book. And so I said, I'm going to have her be part of this army that's going to be going against that. So that I have the you have your ultimate ending. Like you have, it's already pretty much set there, and I get to work with that. I've been blessed to work with that. So basically, that's my outline is getting there. Now, I won't sit down and write like an outline of what I want to do in chapter by chapter by chapter. I kind of just I just go with it, which isn't always, I want to use more outlines. I think it'll be wise to use more outlines, but it just kind of, this particular story just kind of kept flowing. I'm like, oh, this will be cool. This works here. This is going to work in this next spot. And so that's kind of how I went along with that. But yeah, so when I branch off with like I said, I'm going to be returning to this universe, I guess you would call it. When I branch off with that, there's going to be more outlining involved in that, because I know because it's going to be characters that aren't the main characters, that aren't Angela and Sean, so I'll have to really go into, like, how do I want them to be? Because they're only briefly in certain parts of this, but they would make a great story on their own. So I'm going to be using outlines for that, just because I want to make sure I get that right. I want to put as much passion and thought into that as I do it, like with these books. Because it needs to follow that, the passion needs to go all the way through it, or else it's, I don't want any of them to seem like I gave any more devotion or passion to than the others. Because that doesn't, when I see, if I see an author do that, sometimes you can tell when they're doing that, and it just doesn't sit right with me, so I don't want to be the guy that does that. So, yes.
How do you go about developing your characters?
Develop my characters. So a lot of the characters in these books are like they're gang involved, and so I do pluck a lot from my students. Like I just hear them talking about stuff, and it's one of those, they call it air hustling. 'Cause I'm air hustling. Like they know that I've written like stories about it, and they're like, one kid will be like, "You air hustling, John?" And I'm like, "No." And I'm like, "No." What? Me? No. But they'll know, and then sometimes they mess with me, like, because they know I'll use the slang that they use in there, and sometimes they'll make up words, like they'll literally throw some words out there messing with me, and because they know that I'm going to go home and look on urbandictionary.com, and I'm like, that's not a thing. Like, oh, those guys. I'll come in the next day and I'm like, hey, that's not a thing, and they're like, we know. And I'm like, I almost put it in the book, and they're like, we know. So, but basically, yeah, for a lot of the characters, to keep it as genuine as possible, I base it off mostly about their, like the dialogue they use, the slang they use, and just some of the things they talk about. And I pick apart, I can see how they feel when they talk about certain things. And I'm like, all right, well, that's how he would feel about that. Like, he wouldn't, like, they're not, even when they do things that they shouldn't have done, they're not proud of it. They made these choices, they acknowledge that they were bad choices, and I get to see in their conversation, I get to see that they know it's a bad choice, and so I know how they would react to certain things. So when I have my characters do certain things, I have them react how they would react. I don't have them react like glorifying what they've done. So, and then again, in these books, those gang members, they become like heroes. Again, so it's one of those things I wanted these kids to see, even when kids make bad choices, they can still be heroes. So I want them to see a hero that they can relate to. Because I want people to think that way about them too. And they do a lot of great stuff. And that's why in the book I'm writing now, I include a lot of the great stuff they do. Yes?
I have to say, it's not a question. I have to say, what I really enjoyed about it was just that humanizing of the bad people. Like, people make bad decisions, it doesn't make them bad, and there's hope for them to do better down the road. And being in this day and age, there are very few of us that wear our Christianity out for the whole world to see. So I just thought it was really powerful for both of those themes to kind of come through in a way that was subtle, but cool, and it's okay. So I just had to...
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question. I have read books 1 and 2. I've not yet had the pleasure to read book 3, but I know there's been that time span of difference when you wrote 1 and 2 versus when you wrote 3. What is different about 3 in terms of how you've evolved as a writer?
That's a good question. Well, 3 has been 3 was written after I've read a bunch of fantasy books that when I wrote 1 and 2, I hadn't read fantasy books. Like I couldn't even, maybe like Harry Potter, but I didn't even finish that series. Watch the movies instead. But it was one of those things where, which is horrible for an English teacher and a writer to say, but it's the truth. But so since then, I have, like I said, I've read a lot of fantasy books, so I've seen what that genre needs more. There's more of what that genre needs in book 3, or what the readers of that genre would like to see, in my opinion, in book 3 than in book 1 and 2. And it's like, there's there's epic stuff in book 3.
Dragons? Are they dragons?
Pirates.
To the lovely lady in back. No, there are no dragons. There are no dragons. I have not written a dragon.
What about pirates?
Pirates.
Good question.
Pirates. There are no pirates in there. No pirates. We have outwitted the pirates. As we find out, they're not a problem anymore, pirates. So.
And the dragons have all been slayed?
Exactly. Any other questions? Yes.
If this were to become a movie, who would you want to play Angela and who would you want to play Sean?
Ooh. Angela.
Rosie Perez.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Do you have a fantasy
Yeah.
Latino actors,
I don't think I know many. I don't watch the show, but the only murders happen in the building. I don't know, whatever. That show at Steve Martin show, yeah, Selena Gomez. She would make a good Angela. She'd make a good Angela. And Michelle Rodriguez actually from she was in, yeah. So back when like 10 years ago, she looked more like a teenage like Angela would. So and that's when I wrote it 10 years ago. So and Sean, that's a tough one. Sean would. I don't know a lot of today's actors. That sounds horrible. But no, Sean, probably I would throw the guy that plays Spider-Man, Tom Holland. So he would make a good Sean. So, because also like I guess in Sean like I didn't read a lot of fantasy, but I did read like a lot of comic books and everything. And like the Peter Parker always kind of like I guess you could see some of his characteristics in there, but just because other than myself, like that's if I'm going to base it loosely on a character that I'm quite familiar with, it's Peter Parker. So he's kind of he becomes a hero, but he's also kind of that like normal teenage kid. So thrust into a big situation. He was thrust into a huge situation in this. So. All right. Yes.
John, you said you don't necessarily stick to an outline, but you probably have an overarching theme. What happens when you get on a tangent? Does it go in a different direction? Perhaps after an IPA or two later? Do you then veer off into that direction and try to develop the characters that way, or do you kind of come back to?
If it makes sense for that direction to come into back into the, on the path to the main, like how I want it to end. If that makes sense, then yeah, I will do that. But if it doesn't make sense and I do like the direction that that's headed in, then I'll bookmark that. I'll put that off to the side or in my important box, as my wife makes fun of. I have all my old notebooks that I write all the stuff in. It goes in my important box, which is cardboard. So if there's ever a fire, I lose everything. But it's anyways, it'll go in there, because I'll write a different story at some point. I'll be like, I want to remember that. So there's a bunch of things in there, just like circumstances like that, where that could make a cool story. I'm going to put it in there. Even if it doesn't work for this story, it'll work for another story. It'll be its own story.
Some of them are on Post-it notes. Ooh, they have an important box.
You need to get a fireproof box.
Yeah. Exactly.
Christmas is coming. Yeah.
True.
Ask Santa.
Yeah.
Is it filled with little notebooks too?
Uh-huh.
Filled with little notebooks?
They all look like this.
I knew you were gonna have one in your pocket.
Never leave home without it. I've pulled over into, on the way home from work, I've pulled over into, Wendy's parking lot to write down notes. Probably look like a creep while I'm doing it, but now I can, carry one of these with me, and I'm like, it's okay, I'm an author, so. Just writing a book.
Write that thought down.
Yeah. But, so, basically, yep, that was it. Yes?
John, you talked about how your students read your book. Did you use them as a focus group to read the book before it went into production? And if not, would you consider doing that as you move forward with the series, like using some sort of focus groups, whether they're your own students or your kids or their friends or just young people in general?
So I didn't use them as a focus group for this, but like going forward with it, like I'll maybe not show them the whole manuscript, but I'll run by scenarios by them, say, hey, would this be a good storyline? Because they know now that they've read the story, so they know this quote unquote universe. So they'll tell if I run a storyline or an idea or a scene by them and whatnot, and they relate to the characters, I'll say, would this be something that you think would fit in good with that? And they'll tell me if it's trash. They'll tell me now I have a whole bunch of beta readers that they use more colorful language than my original beta reader, but they'll tell me basically. I'll run scenarios by them so for book 3 I ran a few scenarios by them and they're like, okay, I want to read it now. So I'm like, oh, so well you'll have to wait, but yes.
Did you have this as required reading for your students, or was this something that they came to you and said, can we read your book?
I told them if they don't read my book, their time's going to be extended. Okay. No. I just put it on the bookshelf in my classroom, and I don't, it's what they heard about it before it came out, so they were like, they all wanted to read it, and so I put it on the shelf in there. And then some kids, like I'll get new kids all the time, so one kid was looking at the books the other day, and he's looking for a kind of like an inner city type book or whatever. So he's looking around, and I'm like, yeah, and I go, I hear good things about this one. And so he's like, and I kept a straight face, but he's like looking at the back, and he's like, wait a minute. And he gave it like 3 looks, and I'm like, yeah, no, that's me. And he goes, I'm not reading that, that's probably corny. And then another kid's like, no, it's fire, read it. And I'm like, it's fire. Listen to him.
Now you need a firebox.
Listen to him. Listen to her. He's tougher than you. Read it. But yeah, no, I don't require it, but they all wanted to read it. So they think they can get the book 3 before everyone else because they're like, but you wrote it for us. I'm like, book 3 is kind of for everybody, but but yes.
John, how do you feel that you've grown or evolved as a writer from back in the days of staying after Mrs. Jones to books and your future books that you're working on now?
I think I've become better at describing scenarios, whereas, like I had mentioned earlier, so I went to school for film, for screenwriting, and scripts are heavy dialogue. Hardly any description, but heavy dialogue. So when I started writing manuscripts and novels, I was heavy on the dialogue, and I'm like, all right, you gotta get better at describing things. Because I'd be like, once I started reading more for fun, which if I was a teenager and you said, what do you read for fun, I wouldn't know how to answer that question. Because I wouldn't consider, it wasn't really fun to me back then. But now that I read for, as an adult, I read for fun. And so it's one of those things where the more I read, I'm like, oh, that person's great at describing things. Oh, the scene they set without even having a word of dialogue yet, I gotta get better at that. So that's how I've evolved from that. So a lot of descriptions in this book, in these books, when I was writing that book that you mentioned, there was not a lot of description in that book. There was a lot of dialogue because it was fresh off writing screenplays. So, and I think writing the short stories, like the horror stories, that prepared me a little more because with a short story, you have a much shorter time, and you don't want that all dialogue. You want a lot of description in there, especially in horror, because they want to be scared, and they're not going to be scared by dialogue. If you ask my students, nothing I wrote scared them. But so I snuck. That's one thing. I snuck some horror stories in there for my students. So around Halloween, I always throw one on up on the projector, and I take out my name. So I'm like, I just want to see, because they like horror, so I want to see what they think. And they're always like, I'm like, what do you think? This is pretty scary, huh? And they're like, no, this is not scary. This is not at all scary. And I'm like, no, it's kind of scary. And they're like, no. But so like I said, because of stuff like that, I've gotten better at setting moods and describing things and setting up scenarios. So that's how I've evolved as a writer. since that book. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
Who are some of your favorite writers now?
So my favorite all-time writer is J.D. Salinger, which is weird because I only like one of his books, which is I love Catcher in the Rye. I've read it 20 times. You know, it's one of those books you either love it or you hate it. A lot of people hate it, but I love it. So that's the voice that I've always wanted to write in my writing, like the Holden Caulfield voice. So a lot of like Sean, kind of like little Holden in there, but it's just because that's what I've been chasing. Which then when I wrote the Angela parts, I'm like, oh, I can't really make it sound like Holden. You know, it's one of those things. But other than that, I love Mark Twain. I try it for fantasy. I like George R.R. Martin. And I kind of got the idea to break up certain, certain perspectives kind of from his books, because he kind of dedicates each chapter to one of the characters in Game of Thrones. So basically that. And other than that, my new favorite author is a guy named Paul Tremblay. He's also local, not from Easton, but he's written a couple horror books that I got into since I've been writing the horror. And I'm like, I love his voice, like the way he writes and whatnot. So that's another voice that I've been trying to like not emulate, but pick some stuff from here and there. I said I want my books to look a little more like that, sound a little more like that. So, but yeah, those are the authors that keep me inspired. Anybody else? Yes.
What advice would you give to somebody who's interested in writing?
Somebody's interested in writing, just grab a little notebook. Not a big notebook. Grab a little notebook like the one I just showed, because you can bring that anywhere. I always keep it in my front pocket. Like, it doesn't matter if it's, start small. Start with just like a few paragraphs, or start like, do a free write. I have my students do free writes, like where you just, don't worry about paragraphs, don't worry about anything like that. Just write a story out there, or write your feelings out, and just as long as you're writing, it's one of those things where nothing has to be perfect. No one starts out Mark Twain. No one starts out Ernest Hemingway. They always start out themselves, they end themselves, and they write to entertain yourself at first, and then worry about everyone else. Like, if you're writing the story you want to tell, so if I had tried to write the Twilight type books, I would not have been writing for myself, so it would not have come out genuine. So write for yourself, and then worry about what other people think about it. If you want to even have other people read it. You don't always have to have people read it. Just start writing, because writing is going to take you places. If you apply to college, you write an essay. Writing can take you anywhere, literally. Emails, love letters, the whole deal. But first write for yourself, and then worry about other people after that. And even if you're the only one who ever reads it, that's all that matters. You're still writing. And fall in love with reading. I started falling in love with reading when I was a kid, and then I drifted away from it. And then I wish I hadn't, because there's a lot more books that I'm sure I missed in those years. So like people bring up books. I see books on the shelf in my classroom, and I'm like, oh, I wish I read that. But now I do, and as a 49-year-old, I do grab it and read it, and then I look at it, and I'm like, oh, I wish I read this back then. So I wish I never took that break from being in love with reading, because that was a relationship I had to get back with. So, but all right, I'm gonna head out into the hallway. If you have a book with you, I'm happy to sign it. I'll also have books out there if anyone would like a book, and they can purchase it, and I'll sign that for them. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Like I said, this is what a dream looks like. You're all in a dream right now. So, and we're not going to wake up from it.
So we're not going to pinch you.
No, I don't need to be pinched. Thank you, but thank you very much.